today's topic is about how to stay motivated. And so here's a hyper focus that can show up with ADHD too. I was so fascinated by the research about how to stay motivated. I got into the neuroscience of everything. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, is with motivation, like sometimes I think people think like it's something about us, that like we got to think about something else or different, or that we're lazy, or that our thinking is wrong, or there can be shame connected to that. And what's really neat is to address this from like a systemic perspective, and that's a little bit of what we're doing today. Is really going into the neuroscience of motivation, and dopamine, which is obviously really fascinating. So with the neuroscience of it, what I want to start out with was two things. Is one, like the two types of motivation, because this is going to show up in the call and the content that we're going to talk about. So there's two types of motivation. So the first one is intrinsic motivation. And what this is you're self-motivated. So you're self-motivated to do something because of how it makes you feel, not because of a reward. So like an example is you sell or invest in real estate because you like the day-to-day activities or the connection with the clients and the challenge of it. And it's not about like being recognized or rewarded. It's just really like literally the activity of it or the enjoyment of it. So that's intrinsic motivation. It comes from in you, you're self-motivated. And then we have extrinsic motivation. So this is, as you can imagine, intrinsics inside, extrinsics outside, is you complete a task or work towards a goal to receive a reward or avoid a consequence. So like you sell houses and you're in real estate primarily because what's really motivating you is ranking in the top 10 in your region, or to avoid a consequence where you sell because you have to pay for groceries or your family's going to struggle. That's something outside of you, the extrinsic motivation. And you might alternate between the two as well. You might flip back and forth. One might be stronger or other. So that's like the two main things about motivation in the two types. So now I want to talk about the neuroscience of motivation. And basically, I'm going to do a screen share on this here. I want to show you and what the path is. So the first thing is there's an intrinsic or there's an extrinsic stimulus that's introduced, right? And this is something we could just think about, whether we're getting like it's something we want to do, it's motivating, it's exciting to us, or it's something that like external, like a consequence we're avoiding, or something, a reward that's going to be recognized. So what happens is the brain starts producing dopamine, and then if you see this blue pathway, this is the reward pathway. So the dopamine is then sent to the frontal cortex, which we know develops a little bit differently with ADHD. And these are the reward pathways to the frontal cortex. So as soon as there's an abundance of the dopamine in the frontal cortex, our brain says, hey, something good is going to happen. You're about to get a reward. And then we feel motivated, and then we can execute on that task, or we can take action. This is the neuroscience of it. And these are just my notes. I've read a bunch of articles. So obviously you guys know I'm not a neuroscientist, and this is the interpretation of like the articles and the stuff that I saw, and I'm kind of like simplifying it instead of making it super complicated. So that's what happens. It's like intrinsic or external motivation is created, dopamine's created, and boom, we go here. So we have, and dopamine, when we look at motivation, dopamine is really like the key factor here. And with ADHD, we can have a like misregulation of that. We can have like too little or too much. And so this is an example. If we have like too low of dopamine, anybody get food cravings sometimes, or do that to kind of regulate themselves? Substance abuse is a lot more prevalent with ADHD. Impulsivity, high-risk behavior, which again, there's a silver lining to many of these things. But with dopamine, we can have, a lot of us have lower dopamine levels. And then with the misregulation, it can also spike, right? Or we can get too much. Anybody have anxiety? A lot of us have anxiety, more feelings of pain, because dopamine is this thing that calms us. It's the happy chemical. And so we might swing between too much and too little. And really the ideal is kind of that middle level. And so someone without an ADHD brain, they're more likely to not have as big of swings, just depending on how their brain is wired. So those are two graphics right there of just, and we'll send out the notes like we're doing. And so what I want to talk about, because there's gonna be a lot of shame with ADHD, is you see how if you have maybe an issue with motivation, that it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. You see that this is not an excuse, it's an explanation as to why motivation might be a little bit more challenging. It's not a character flaw in you, and it's not that you're just not disciplined enough. There's more to it. And so sometimes when we want to get motivated for something, but that's the other thing, is like this thing we want is in direct competition with something that's more dopamine producing, and we're already at a deficit, a lot of us, it's going to add an extra layer of challenge. So for example, if we want to like lose weight and get healthy, but sugar produces dopamine and we're already a little bit of a deficit, it's going to be harder to resist the dopamine because our brain's like producing more dopamine to go get the dopamine, because we've got this association or this memory of that thing producing dopamine and the other thing not. Or is anybody else like sat down to do lead generation and then end up going on social media instead? That was dopamine, right? And so again, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And so this is going to give us more information of like, how do we work with this? Because we absolutely can. So I'm going to go through some of the like main things we can do then for motivation. So one, you know, you guys know I've never had a non-ADHD brain. If you have an ADHD brain, it's wired differently. And so with that, sometimes I guess for me, it's like there's a delay for the dopamine being produced. Have you ever had that where it's hard to get started, but then once you get going, then it's fine? It's like, oh, if I could just do that first step, if I could just start. And so again, this isn't like I didn't necessarily read this in an article, it's just like observing my brain. It's like there's a delay in the dopamine being produced. And then once you get started, then it gets easier. And so one thing you can do is just remind yourself that it's like a chemical thing. And if you just take the first step, it gets easier, because if there's not dopamine, it can feel really hard, right? It can feel really, really hard. And then we can have this image in our head of like, this whole thing is going to be hard. It's going to be a drag. Like doing this whole activity is just going to be a drag. If it already feels hard, it's already going to be so much harder. And we have that story in our head. And yet when you finally sit down to lead gen and you make that first call and you talk to a client and you check in how their day, how easy is that second call? It's so much easier once you've got that, once the dopamine going. And so like cognitively, just reminding yourself about the neuroscience of this is that sometimes it's hard to start. And then who has this? Once you get started, it's actually sometimes hard to stop. Have you ever had that? Yeah, right. Right. Once you get going, then it's actually can be like really hard to stop. And so that's the other thing, is because we can have more dopamine, and there's the brilliance of it, is that hyper focus ability is where we can keep going where someone else can't. Or somebody without ADHD, they're like, I mean, I don't know if anybody has like a neurotypical partner. It's like, okay, I need a break from this. This is too much. Or like, okay, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm so tired of hearing about this show or this interest you have, or like you could just tell people. I mean, sometimes I don't catch it right away when I talk about ADHD. It's like they've withdrawn like 5 minutes ago, and I'm still going on ADHD or real estate, and I've overstayed my welcome, but I'm so passionate because it just doesn't stop. And so reminding yourself that, you know, it can swing both ways. And also with less dopamine, we talked about this before. Remember, less dopamine, what it can do is it makes us calm, because when we look back at the chart, let me show you this again, because there is gifts in this too. It's kind of the price to pay for the gifts, is that sometimes our motivation can be a little bit more finicky, but it's a price we pay for the gifts that come with it. And so if dopamine's too high, it's anxiety. It can feel kind of manic or aggressive, or, and paranoia, all kinds of high blood pressure. So if we have less dopamine and we get in a situation like, let's say there's a car wreck that you witnessed, you're not in it, but then we can go over it and we can be super grounded and calm and say, hey, It's okay. Okay, you call 911. I'm going to sit with you. I'm going to talk with you. I'm going to be like soothing, help you ground. You do this. Hold on, go put the cones out there so nobody comes. It's okay. I got, it could be a really grounding presence, which is why we have emergency workers and surgeons and performers that have ADHD. Is there anyone here who really likes teaching or training or presenting or anything like that? We have that. Yeah, we have quite a bit of people. Other people, think of that. One of the biggest fears is public speaking that people have. One of the biggest fears is public speaking, and yet we have how many people on the call that raise their hand that like to present? That's not normal. Normally, people are like, ugh, no, that's too much pressure. So again, there's a benefit to this. There's a silver lining to a lot of this stuff that we have. And right, motivation can be a little bit more finicky. So reminding yourself, it can be hard to start, but once we get started, it's easier. The dopamine kicks in and we can actually go faster, longer than other people. So then number two, about how do we work with this and how do we get motivated? Number two is, since we already have less dopamine in the brain, focusing on increasing dopamine in general from healthy sources gives our brain more to work with. It makes it easier for the receptors to receive the dopamine. It's helpful for our brain. And we want, when I say healthy sources, that's what I mean, which is, and I'll talk about those because we can get it from unhealthy sources, risk taking, addiction stuff, too much screen time. I don't think social media is terrible. I think there's great things about it. And yeah, sometimes it can be not helpful too. And so we want to increase the natural dopamine in our system, in our brain, the receptors, because like I said at the beginning, I want to give you something. It's about how to get motivated and how to stay motivated. And so we're not looking for some rah thing that's going to fizzle out. How do we approach it systemically where motivation is easier for you overall instead of having to do all this effort? Because doing a routine or effort or getting motivated in the moment takes dopamine because you're taking action. So how do we have a lifestyle change where you have more dopamine? The receptors in your brain are more likely to create that abundance of dopamine when you need it. So how do we create more healthy dopamine? You can probably guess exercise is huge with ADHD. Exercise actually directly affects the part of the brain, the frontal cortex. It directly addresses that part of our brain with ADHD that's develops differently in utero. And so by exercising, it's similar to taking medicine. And studies show that besides medicine, exercise is one of the most effective things that you can do for ADHD. And it could be just 15 minutes of movement. So it doesn't have to be this big extreme thing where you do this huge workout or this challenge. I mean, it can, but it doesn't need to be this huge thing. It could be that even if you're finding, there's different levels of I need to get motivated. One person's, hey, I want to get motivated because I want to do this big project and I'm already at work and I just want to take it to the next level. And the next person say, I want to get motivated because I can't get out of bed, right? We're going to have a spectrum of what motivated means to you and where you're at and what you want to get motivated about. And so if you're the person that can't get out of bed, just even rolling out of bed and stretching on the floor is going to create dopamine. If you can't roll out of bed, lifting your legs up, I mean, your arms, tensing your muscles or your abs, it's going to help create a little bit of dopamine, which then is going to help you. Where to the other extreme, if you can get in, you go run for 20 minutes before you start work, that can be helpful too, right? Because that's going to create dopamine as well. And what's really interesting, I don't know if anybody's noticed this, is have you ever exercised where it almost makes you feel like there's too much dopamine? Like, I don't know if anybody's experienced it. I just thought it was me. Okay, so we had that. Okay, I didn't know that, and I said it to my therapist, and I said I almost feel manic. And so like some days working out in the morning is great and it gives me what I need. Some days, if I go past a certain amount, I'm gonna have too much dopamine, and I'm gonna have more trouble kind of being focused in what I need to do, or I'm gonna have to really regulate. It's like there's a short circuit in my brain, and so some of this self-awareness of just we're going to need to regulate ourselves a little bit more than someone without ADHD. And so, one day listen to your body. One day, I might work out for 2 hours. I've done triathlons before. The next day I might go for a walk because doing a really hard workout for running or something I know is going to take me over the edge, and it can vary day to day. However, any exercise, walking, anything is going to help your brain regulate, and it's going to create more dopamine. Then the next thing of creating like more healthy dopamine. Who here has heard me talk about Incup before? I know we have some people who are on most of the calls. Okay. Okay, so we got a few. So Incup, this is where Incup is, the acronym Incup is so important. So Incup are the 5 things that create dopamine. And this could be non-ADHD too. It's especially important for us. And this is why I've talked about this and pushed it quite a bit. So Incup stands for if it's interesting, new, challenging, urgent, or a passion. Interesting, new, challenging, urgent, or passion. These 5 things create dopamine in our brains. And so they're going to be easier when we go back to, I'm going to do a screen share again. When we go back to this and we see if it's interesting, new, challenging, urgent, and passion, a lot of times just thinking about it creates the dopamine. We got the abundance and we're good. And we actually have more to do what we need to do than someone without ADHD. And so that's where that acronym Incup, and why like that's something I speak to about getting your business into Incup, is because you're not going to have to you're not going to have to do all these things to get motivated. Your brain's going to do it for you. If it's interesting, if it's new, if it's challenging, if it's urgent, if it's a passion. And so if there's something you need to do and you just can't get motivated, the first thing I'd say is, how do we get it connected to that? How do we find a way to plug into Incup? Because boom, then you're going to get that dopamine, and you're going to have the abundance that you need. Which again, dopamine, pleasure, fine tuning, perseverance, reward. It's a lot of different things that dopamine can be a part of. So okay, let's see. So then, kind of going back to that. So then we got the exercise, getting your activities, getting your business into Incup. That's going to make that easier. And so what we've talked about is the first thing is like reminding yourself just kind of the neuroscience, how things work. Number 2 is creating more dopamine in the brain, so there's more to work with, and kind of helping that. And then I want to talk about improving the dopamine regulation, because like we talked about, sometimes it can spike a little bit, or it can be way too low. Most people, it's too low. Most of us, I mean, well, in the studies show we have less dopamine. So the biggest thing with dopamine regulation, sleep can really affect that. And it's actually really interesting when you look into it. So sleep can affect our emotion regulation. It's again, besides meds, exercise, and then sleep, those are like 3 things that really have an impact on it. I don't know if anybody's experienced this. When you have less sleep, have you ever experienced like a happiness sometimes? I don't know if this is like more dopamine's produced. Have you experienced that sometimes? It's okay. Okay. So and this is something that I've read about, I've experienced too. So when we have less sleep, what happens is our brain produces cortisol. It's like a stress hormone. So like not sleeping can be addictive too. It's interesting. So when we don't sleep, what happens is our body's like, oh my gosh, we don't have as much sleep, we don't have as much energy. So we got to produce cortisol, and we got to produce dopamine because it's like a survival thing. Because if you're tired, you're going to be less on, you're going to be less able to do things. And so we can actually like not sleep because we might be pursuing video games or watching something at night, or doing something, being on social media, because that produces dopamine. Then we have less sleep, and then the body says, here's cortisol, here's stress hormones, which is endorphins, which is dopamine. And so it actually can kind of produce more, but then we can have mood stuff, and it can be really interesting. And so it can help us function when we have that dopamine, but it's a stress related one and it's not as regulated. Whereas if we sleep and we stop the pattern, then our brain can actually regulate when we want more or less. And that's why our moods can be better when we have better sleep, is because our brain can say, oh, do you want dopamine now? Okay, let's pull back. Oh, do you want more serotonin? Whereas we're a sleep deficit, the brain's just like, here's endorphins, here's stress hormones, here's cortisol, and here's a whole bunch of dopamine, because you might have to run away from a bear, right? Like if we look at the biology of things, like survival. And so if you find yourself in a pattern of not having sleep and almost feeling addicted to it, which it's not everybody, that's something to think about. It's like resetting. And it might take a couple days to reset, and then your sleep then is going to be able to regulate better, because we want to give our body the best chance possible to regulate our chemicals and our dopamine, our norepinephrine, and our serotonin, and all of those things. We really want to give it the best advantages. So sleep and is going to be big. And then medicine, if you choose to go that route, if you talk with your doctor about that, that will help your emotion regulation. They have certain meds that will help with emotion regulation. That's something I experience. One of my biggest symptoms is emotional regulation. I could go from like moody or like kind of depressed to crying to happy to like it was like blah, blah, blah. And that's why a lot of people get misdiagnosed with bipolar because of that, because they can look like that but doesn't present the same as bipolar. It's ADHD. And so there are some medications that don't, stimulants that don't just produce dopamine, they actually help regulate it and help because we can also have an impairment in the uptake of dopamine in our receptors is the word I'm looking for. So if you choose to go meds, if things feel debilitating, it's definitely worth going to an ADHD center. And I say that over a primary care doctor because you can, there's definitely training with primary care doctors, not like people that are in it all the time. And so you can go into somebody that works with ADHD meds and adults and say, here are my symptoms, and they're more likely to be able to say, oh, here's here's a main brand of medicine, and I like, let's say it's Adderall or something, and then here's this type that does emotion regulation off of that. Let's try this first. Or, oh, you have a substance abuse history and you're worried about substances. Well, here's one that a lot of people with substance abuse history do well on, that's still a stimulant, or a non-stimulant that can address this. And so you're going to get a more specialized approach because there's a ton of different types of meds that you can take, which I'm working on getting the doctors on and an ADHD center on. I met with them last week to come talk about meds. And so you can get ones that can help regulate that. And then, especially for stimulants, you can choose to not take them on the weekends if you don't want to. Or if you don't like the side effects, you can stop, right? They don't build up in your system like SSRIs. So if it feels really debilitating and it's something you want to pursue, go to an ADHD center or a nurse practitioner that specifically understands those meds. And the next one I want to talk about is addressing the nutritional deficiencies. So I don't know if you knew, we have statistically much lower levels of vitamin D. That's the majority of us have lower levels of vitamin D. And what a lot of doctors recommend, and talk to your doctor, is that your levels are at 50 or above. And I mean, I'll give you an example. Mine is like historically under 30, and I've taken 5 times the amount of vitamin D, and it got me to like 35. So low vitamin D levels directly correlate with your uptake of dopamine. It's like the biggest one. So if you have low levels of vitamin D, and that's something that doctors will check. That's a big one that they check. It also can help be a preventative for different diseases we can get. And so get your blood work done, see where your vitamin D level is at. And then if it's not above 50 or whatever your doctor recommends, then definitely work to get that up, because what's a lot easier, again, when we address this systemically, is these things that you do and you get set in place and you don't have to do again. And that's what I wanted for today versus, like there's some cognitive stuff in there, but it's like, what's the permanent thing? What's the long-term thing that's going to help you get motivated and then stay that way? Because again, this is not you just not being disciplined, right? This is not you just not doing enough or not trying hard enough. That's not what this is. There's neurochemical stuff going on. And so we want to address it from a physiological perspective versus just psychological, which is what a lot of people are doing. So now I do want to talk a little bit about like the thinking part of things. So I want to talk about if anybody's heard of like the two main motivators, like if you've taken like Bold, the class we have with Kel Williams, they'll talk about motivation, that kind of stuff. So what one good thing in there is they talk about which is interesting, is that we as humans we have two main motivators. You may know what those are, like the two main motivators. Like going away from pain or going towards pleasure. Like as humans, we're going away from pain or we're going towards pleasure, right? And depending on the situation, sometimes pain can be stronger if it's extreme. Like if you're in a burning building, and you have to jump out a window to survive, you're probably going to jump out a window. You're not going to just sit there. Pain's a great motivator to avoid that pain. Whereas if you really want to eat like a scoop of ice cream, you're not going to have as strong of a motivation, but you're going to go towards it. Now, once we get away from the burning building, then majority of people with ADHD can be more motivated by going towards pleasure. So once we get out of that extreme situation, the difference is that, because again, we're seeking dopamine, we're at a deficit. And so when you're motivating yourself, if you're a rare anomaly where you're still motivated by pain, there's still a few of us, and that's okay. Studies show the majority of us are motivated by pleasure or good things. So we want to look at self-talk, how we're talking to ourselves. And I'm not talking about, when I talk about going away from pain, or going towards pleasure, when we're talking to ourselves, if we're beating ourselves up, which anybody beat themselves up or shame themselves or try to force themselves, that's what a lot of times we do. That does not help. That's not the route that's going to take you to where you need to go. It's if it does, it's just going to be painful and it might be slower and harder for you to get there. So we want to look at the self-talk and how we're addressing ourselves, because we're going to do things, we're going to go more towards like pleasure or positive things. So here's an example. This is so I used to work with kids, because I've talked about talking to yourself like a kid. So I used to work with kids with a lot of behavior issues, like operational defiance. Man, I'm butchering the name of it. ODD is what it's called. ODD, and it's like a behavioral thing. It's not OCD, it's ODD, where it's a resistance to authority and really hard to listen, and there's a lot more to it. And so that's what I did before mental health and before real estate is extreme resistance in kids that come from trauma. And let's say you need them to get their shoes tied. They don't really care about painful like consequences sometimes, you know? So if I went to them and I said, hey, put your shoes on or you're going to get a timeout, they're going to be like, you know, like, whatever, I'm not doing what you do, or you're not my dad, or like whatever. It's not going to work. Or you try to force them and then they cry, and if you're a parent, you got to, you know, it doesn't work as well. And same thing with us. Yeah, if I take that same kid and I say, hey, come here a second. How long does it take you to tie your shoes? Like, how fast are you? They're like, oh, I'm really fast. I don't know. Like, how fast? Oh, like 1 second. I don't know. Well, okay, well, let's see. Oh, and I'm like, don't start yet. Let me get a timer and we're gonna see. Because I bet you can't do it in 5 seconds or less. And then you set the timer and they go really fast and their shoes are on, right? Instead of a half hour of dragging them. And then you say, oh my God, you are so fast that you are so good at tying your shoes. That's amazing. Can you show them? And so the next time you see them, you're like, that's that fast shoe tire. You got to see this. Come look at this. And then now they want to show you how fast they put their shoes on, and you're not having this fight. And it's the same thing with their jacket. Well, you're fast at tying your shoes. How fast are you putting your coat on? And so we're getting excited and we're making it a challenge, and we're rewarding them, and we're saying, wow, you're so good at that, you know? And same thing with us, right? Maybe not tying our shoes, but like noticing the things that we do well, because we do really well in a lot of good things. That is so much more motivating, because what happens to the kids' energy, or to our energy, if we say, hey, do this, or here's this painful thing that's going to happen, you have no choice? What happens to our energy? Does it go up or down? Like it sucks, right? But if we say, hey, do this thing and I'm going to be proud of you, like if you're talking to yourself, like, hey, do this thing and I'm going to be proud of you, and you look for the things you're doing, what does that do to our energy and our dopamine? Right, we go up. And so really watch how you're talking to yourself. Reward yourself for the little wins, the little things that you do right. If you have trouble doing anything and you do one small task, just practice, see what happens if you reward yourself, watch what happens to your energy, and then see what happens, because for a majority of us, that positive reinforcement is going to create more dopamine and it's going to be easier. So I know I left just a few minutes. That's what I have for today around motivation. A little bit different take. Was that helpful from like the systemic versus this like affirmations? Okay, that's what I was thinking. I want to give you something different and something that's permanent. Yeah, and we'll send the notes and the recording out. I appreciate you guys, and I know you guys messaged me about how you feel so supportive, and I like feel the support right back. Like I feel like I have a community as well. So yeah, so know that, if you're having motivation issues, that's the price to pay for all the really incredible gifts that we have, because we have so many. And talk to yourself kindly and reward yourself, and recognize the good things you're doing, because you're doing so much good. So that's what I have for today. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, I appreciate you guys, and I will see you on Facebook or here next Tuesday. So, all right, have a good one. All right, take care.